In the spring of 1200 BC, a girl named Nefertari stood trembling in the stone courtyard of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak, while priests circled her with bronze razors gleaming in the morning sun. She was 9 years old. 3 days earlier, her father had brought her to these towering walls and kissed her forehead one final time before walking away forever. He was a minor official who owed the temple a debt he could not repay in silver or grain, so he paid it with something else. His daughter, Nefertari, didn't understand what was happening to her. She knew only what her father had whispered as he left her at the temple gates, that she had been chosen for a great honor, that she would serve the gods themselves, that she should be grateful, and never question what came next. Now, as the razor scraped across her scalp and her long black hair fell in dark pools around her bare feet, Nefertari began to cry. The sound was small at first, a child's whimper, but it grew louder as the reality crashed over her. An older priestess moved swiftly and struck her hard across the face. "Servants of the god, do not weep," the woman said, her voice cold as the temple stone. "You have no tears anymore. You have no name anymore. You belong to Ammon now, and Ammon does not accept weakness." This was Nefertari's introduction to a life that would span 43 years. A life of confinement and control, of systematic exploitation hidden behind walls, covered in hieroglyphs praising divine glory. She would never leave these temple grounds. She would never marry or bear children of her own. She would never own property or make a single decision about her body or her future. She would serve in silence and obedience until the day she died and was buried in an unmarked grave with no family to mourn her and no name recorded for history to remember. But here's what most people don't know, what the tour guides won't tell you when you visit these ancient temples today. Nefertari was not unusual. She was not an isolated victim of abuse in an otherwise noble system. She was one of thousands of girls and women who spent their entire lives trapped inside Egyptian temples, bearing titles that sounded sacred but masked a reality darker than anything carved into those stone walls. They were called God's wives, servants of the divine, hands of the goddess, the pure ones, the divine adoratrix. Beautiful names for a system that destroyed lives as efficiently as any battlefield, that exploited the vulnerable as systematically as any slave market, that erased identities as completely as any conqueror ever erased a defeated city from existence. This is the story of what Egyptian priests really did to temple virgins. And before we go any further, you need to understand that what I'm about to describe is not mythology or sensationalized fiction created for entertainment. This is documented in temple inscriptions, in administrative records preserved on papyrus, in the accounts of ancient historians who witnessed these practices firsthand. If you want to understand how religious authority can be weaponized to exploit the defenseless, how sacred language can disguise systematic abuse, then I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to this channel, because we investigate the darkest chapters of ancient history with rigorous attention to evidence and truth. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're re-watching from and whether you've ever stood inside these temples without knowing what truly happened within their walls. Now let me tell you about the myth versus the reality of temple virgins in ancient Egypt, and why everything you think you know about this practice is almost certainly wrong. I'm warning you now, what comes next gets much darker than you're expecting. When most people hear about temple priestesses in ancient Egypt, they imagine something romantic and dignified. They picture elegant women in white linen performing beautiful rituals, honored servants of the gods living lives of spiritual devotion and religious importance. They imagine something noble, something chosen. This romanticized image is completely wrong. And it's wrong in ways that reveal how effectively ancient propaganda worked, how completely the people who designed this system succeeded in hiding what they were really doing behind beautiful language and sacred imagery. The Egyptian terms most commonly used were Hemet Necher, which translates as servant of the god or sometimes wife of the god. There were related titles like Duat Necher, worshipper of the god, or Shemet, singer or musician. Each title carried specific functions and hierarchies, but all shared certain characteristics that should chill you to your core. The women bearing these titles were bound to temple service for life, controlled absolutely by temple hierarchy, and subject to rules that stripped away their autonomy and often their very identities. Most of these women did not choose this life. They were given into temple service, often as children, through several mechanisms that stripped them of agency and choice before they were old enough to understand what was being done to them. Some were pledged by families as religious offerings, a way for parents to curry favor with the gods or fulfill a vow or simply reduce the number of mouths to feed. The dedication was framed as a gift to the divine, as an act of piety. But for the girl, it was permanent abandonment, a severing of family ties that could never be repaired. Others were given as payment for debts, exactly as happened to Nefertari. Temples were massive economic institutions in ancient Egypt. They owned vast estates, lent grain and silver, collected taxes and tribute. Families who owed debts to temples but couldn't pay in currency could sometimes pay with children, usually daughters who would become temple servants. This was legally sanctioned human trafficking disguised as religious devotion. And then there were the girls seized as tribute from conquered territories. Egyptian military campaigns regularly captured populations from Nubia, from Libya, from lands in the Levant. Among the prisoners taken were girls and young women designated for temple service. They would be transported hundreds of miles to Egypt, assigned to various temples, and absorbed into a system of sacred servitude from which they would never escape. But here's what will shock you most. The age at which girls entered the system was horrifyingly young. Temple records reference girls entering service at ages as young as 8 or 9 years old. Some sources suggest even younger. Many of these girls had not reached puberty when they were torn from their families. They were children, unable to consent, unable to understand the full implications of what was happening to them. And what happened next would break them in ways that left scars no physician could see. Let me tell you about another girl. Her name was Mutmo, and she was 8 years old in 1450 BC when soldiers came to her village in Nubia after Egypt conquered the region during the reign of Thutmose III. The soldiers were collecting tribute, gold, ivory, grain, and children. Mutmo was selected along with 12 other girls from families across the region. The girls were bound together with ropes and marched north toward Egypt, a journey of hundreds of miles that took weeks under the burning sun. Mutmua didn't speak Egyptian. She didn't understand what was happening or where she was being taken. She knew only that she had been torn from her mother, from her siblings, from everything she had ever known. She cried constantly during the march until one of the Egyptian guards beat her and told her that crying was forbidden. She learned to weep silently after that, tears streaming down her face while she made no sound at all. When the girls finally arrived at Thebes, they were distributed to various temples. Mutmua was assigned to the Temple of Mut, a goddess associated with motherhood and queens. The bitter irony would become apparent over the following years as Mutmua learned the language and came to understand that she was serving a goddess of mothers while being denied any possibility of becoming a mother herself in any normal sense. What happened next to girls like Nefertari and Mutmua was a process designed with psychological precision to break their will and prepare them for a lifetime of absolute submission. When a girl was designated for temple service, she underwent a series of rituals designed to strip away her former identity and reconstruct her as property of the institution. The first ritual was purification through water. The girl would be taken to a sacred pool within the temple grounds and subjected to ritual bathing. This sounds innocent until you understand what it actually involved. The bathing was conducted by priests and senior temple women. The girl would be stripped of her clothing and her body would be washed repeatedly with water mixed with natron, a natural salt compound. But these purification baths were invasive examinations disguised as religious ritual. Priests would inspect the girl's body, ostensibly to ensure she was physically pure and unblemished, suitable for service to the gods. Young girls would be touched and examined by strange men while being told this was sacred duty, that the gods required this inspection, that resistance would anger the divine powers they were meant to serve. When Nefertari was pushed into that cold stone pool, 3 priests and 2 older temple women waited. She was told to remove her clothing. When she hesitated, frightened and embarrassed, one of the women grabbed her roughly and stripped the garments away. A priest stepped into the pool with her, his hands moving over her small body in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. When she flinched away, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise and told her the gods were watching, that she was being tested for worthiness, that if she failed she would bring shame on her family and anger the gods who might punish all of Egypt. Nefertari stood frozen, terrified, while the examination continued. She didn't understand what was being done to her or why. She knew only that these were priests, that they spoke for the gods, that she had been taught all her life to obey religious authority. So she stood still and endured it while tears ran silently down her face and mixed with the water of the purification pool. This early violation, framed as religious necessity, established patterns of control and normalized the idea that these girls' bodies were not their own but belonged to the temple and could be accessed by those with religious authority. After the purification came the shaving ritual, the girl's head completely shaved as a visible marker of transformation, an elimination of individuality and reduction to uniformity. When Nefertari saw herself in a bronze mirror afterward, she didn't recognize the bold child staring back. That stranger wasn't Nefertari. That stranger was what the temple had made her into. The shaving was often accompanied by renaming. Nefertari's birth name was taken away and replaced with Nefertari, beautiful as the lady, a reference to the goddess. Her real name was forbidden. If she was caught using it, she would be punished. The name her mother had given her, the name that connected her to her family and her life before, was declared dead. But the most disturbing part of the dedication process came next. After purification and renaming came what sources describe as the divine marriage ceremony. Girls being dedicated to certain categories of temple service would undergo a ritual where they were symbolically married to the god they would serve. This was presented as a great honor, as becoming the bride of a deity, as achieving a status higher than any earthly marriage could provide. Mutmu was 10 years old when she experienced her divine marriage to the goddess Mut. She was dressed in fine white linen, her head covered with an elaborate wig, her face painted with cosmetics. She was led into the inner sanctuary, a dark stone room lit only by oil lamps, and dominated by the massive statue of the goddess whose inlaid eyes seemed to watch her approach. The high priest stood before the statue and began chanting, speaking for the goddess herself, claiming to be the voice of Mut. Then Mutmu was told to repeat vows. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. I belong to the goddess now and forever. I have no other lord, no other family, no other purpose but service. Mutmo repeated the words she was told to say. She had no choice. She didn't fully understand what she was promising, but she spoke the vows that would bind her legally and religiously for the rest of her life. The priests witnessed and recorded the divine marriage. Mutmo was now legally the property of the temple, with no rights, no autonomy, no possibility of escape. Here's what you need to understand about this divine marriage. It wasn't symbolic. It had real legal consequences. A girl married to a god could never marry a human man. She could not have legitimate children, could not inherit her own property, could not leave temple service. She was bound for life, and there was something else about this divine marriage. Something about how priests interpreted their roles as representatives of the gods. Something about what divine marriage actually meant in practice behind those temple walls. The girls learned quickly that when priests claimed to speak for the gods, they also claimed other privileges on behalf of the divine. Daily life inside the temple was structured and controlled in ways designed to prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. The women slept in communal quarters under constant supervision. They owned nothing. Privacy didn't exist. They would wake before dawn, undergo morning purification, and spend hours in repetitive labor weaving linen, preparing offerings, grinding grain, brewing beer, maintaining gardens. All of this labor benefited the temple as an economic institution, but it was framed as sacred service. They were told their suffering was holy, their confinement was divine will, their abuse was religious duty. Nefertari lived 43 years inside those walls. Mutmo lived 37. Neither of them ever left. Neither ever saw their families again. Neither ever spoke their birth names aloud after those first days. They died as the temple wanted them to die. Silently, obediently, erased from history except as numbers and administrative records. As unnamed servants in the vast machinery of institutional control disguised as religious devotion. When archaeologists excavate these temples today, they find the grand statues and the beautiful inscriptions praising the gods and the pharaohs. What they rarely find are the graves of the temple servants, the girls who were given as offerings and consumed by the system. Those graves, when they exist at all, are unmarked. No names, no monuments, just bones in the sand, silent testimony to lives stolen in the name of the divine. If this story has shaken you, if it's made you think differently about how power can hide behind sacred language, then leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about systems that claim divine authority for their practices, and whether you believe we've truly moved past this kind of exploitation or simply found new ways to disguise it. History remembers the temples, but someone needs to remember the girls.